This is the editing room of a scholar, a professor of philosophy. His name is Huston Smith. For 6 months, Dr. Smith has been doing research on a special project and recording his findings on film. His purpose has been more than usually serious and profound. He's made an attempt to discover America's own moral answers to 16 of the most basic public and private issues that Americans face. In his search, Dr. Smith has traveled thousands of miles and asked literally hundreds of questions. He's talked with scholars and statesmen, newspaper editors and economists, philosophers and politicians. Tonight, from these priceless film records of that journey, Dr. Smith has drawn together what he believes are America's best answers to another basic problem of our future. Tonight on The Search for America.
I'm Huston Smith. The object of our search tonight is the race problem. Our question, what should be the eventual relation between the races in America? In the entire history of our country, I don't think there's ever been a problem so excruciating for our collective conscience as the problem of race. What should be our answer to this question? And what is this answer going to cost us? That's the object of our search. We begin, fittingly enough, in Little Rock, Arkansas, a city that has become a symbol of the entire race problem. Remember Little Rock, proclaims the Great Seal that adorns envelopes going out from white citizens' councils all over the South. Remember Little Rock, cry militant Negroes in northern cities when things become tense. It's a pleasant city, even attractive Little Rock is, but I couldn't help thinking about the dark events of the previous year. From this state capital, Governor Orville Faubus challenged the integration orders of a federal court, a challenge that was heard and is still being heard the world over. And this is Central High School, where American soldiers of the 101st Airborne moved in to enforce the federal authority. The soldiers were no longer standing guard when we were there, but they were still in the area, American soldiers protecting Americans from each other. The man we had come to see is very much a man of this time and place. His name is Harry Ashmore, and he is the executive editor of the Arkansas Gazette. Shortly after I talked to him, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for objective editorial and news coverage of the Little Rock crisis. I talked to him in his home. Mr. Ashmore, what is the goal, the ultimate goal towards which America should be moving in this area? We're going to be getting into specifics very quickly, but before we do, I would like to ask you to sketch for us, if you will, your vision of the kind of America that you hope will emerge someday in regard to race.
Well, Mr. Smith, I would think that there are at least two ways to approach this problem, and perhaps more than that. But in the context in which you ask your question, I suppose we'd have to say that certainly the goal of the Negro minority in the United States is acceptance on a basis of full equality, with all that that implies. That is, each man being judged individually and on his own merit and without any form of legal or extra-legal discrimination. I think we'd also have to concede that this is the goal of America. I think of the kind of country that we founded some hundreds of years ago. I think that this is what the American ethic, if we might reduce it to that, would call for.
Let's ask now as to the direction in which our nation is going. Is the Negro actually gaining more equality and respect?
Yes, I think the long-term trend is definitely in that direction. I've said that, and I believe, that the forces that are working against the rigid forms of legal segregation are stronger than those that are working to sustain it. I think that one of the real problems in the South is the inability of so many Southerners, including so many Southern leaders, to recognize that what we're faced with here is really a historical process. It's the running of time, it's the elevation of the condition of the Southern Negro, and with that an elevation of his aspirations that have created the pressures that now confront us. In that sense, I think the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court was rather a confirmation of an existing fact, rather that than the cause of the dislocations that have followed. I think perhaps the most expensive single delusion the Southern people suffer from is the notion that somehow this is all the product of a little conspiracy, that if the NAACP could be abolished or the Supreme Court's composition could be changed, that all of this would go away. It's my own view that this is absurd. I think that we have reached a point in our development where we've got to make some new accommodation now to take care of the legitimate demands and the rising aspirations of our Negro people.
Speaking of legislation, one often hears that any change that occurs in this area will have to come through the minds and the hearts of men. As the saying goes, that you can't legislate morality, that whatever change must come through education rather than through legislation. Do you think this is true?
I think that is certainly true if we're talking in terms of integration, the larger concept of integration, the acceptance of the Negro by whites on terms of full equality with all that that implies. That obviously is an educational process. We're going to have to change a lot of hearts and a lot of minds. And as a matter of fact, it isn't only Southern hearts and minds that have to be changed in this connection. I think one of the things we've discovered in the last 25 or 30 years in this country is that white Americans, when they come up against the race problem in practical, real terms, react pretty much alike, and that there turns out to be very little difference in the basic attitudes of white men, white Americans, whether they live in the North or South. I think you'll find, and I've seen this happen as a matter of fact, some New Englanders, say a man from Vermont who lived on the side of a mountain all his life, grew up in the abolitionist tradition, and honestly believed that he had no race prejudice and was fully prepared to treat any American without discrimination, white or black. Come down off his mountain and arrive in New York City and face the experience that he would face there in dealing with a new mass of Negroes, discovering really to his horror that he did have race prejudice in practice and that his reactions were pretty much the same as those of the white Southerners he had so often condemned in the past from the remote corner of Vermont. I think that this has been a lesson, and a bitter one, that many Americans have had to learn in this generation.
You've been talking about ways in which changes in racial patterns occur. What actual changes do you foresee in the near future?
And it'll be very difficult to achieve this in a democracy, but it seems to me that what we have to contemplate is an upgrading of the Negro people which will permit an increasing number from the top level of the Negro community to cross over and obtain free passage among the whites. I don't think it's possible for this to be a mass movement in terms of a sudden integration of the separate communities that exist everywhere in this country. The reasons for this are social, I think, in large part. We have to begin with the fact that whether it be his fault or not, the Negro is primarily a slum dweller in the United States, rural or urban, and this is just as true in the North as it is in the South. This piles a caste and a social problem on top of an admitted race problem, because at least 90% of Negroes now live in ghettos. They come of an inferior economic and social and cultural background. They are beset by educational deficiencies, most of those of the present generation. We're only now seeing the emergence of a Negro middle class and the great void that existed for many years between the upper strata of a handful of Negro intellectuals and a great mass of common laborers. There is a middle class now, solid, conservative, respectable, that is providing the leadership of the Negro community, and it's this class that is pressing for greater advantage. I think that class will grow. But I think now we have to visualize a sort of a slow and gradual transition period in which the upper strata of the Negro population will perhaps be accorded different treatment from that accorded to the lower strata. This is a very difficult thing to do, as I say, in a democracy where everybody theoretically must be treated alike. Yet I think the saving grace here may very well be that the pressure for change is lowest among the lowest strata of Negroes. Therefore, in the Deep South and the rural Deep South, there is very little pressure for an end to segregation. It's in the cities that the pressure is greatest and is growing.
Mr. Ashmore, I've asked you about a number of aspects of the racial problem. What do you think is the fundamental problem in this area?
Well, there really are two problems, I think. There is, first of all, the problem we've discussed of attaining a practical accommodation of Negroes at a higher level in our society than white men so far have been willing to accord them. That is an enormous problem and a complex one. But it seemed to me that in the South, and I think this is largely true now everywhere in the country, that a still greater problem is our inability as a people to reduce this issue to rational terms. We go off on emotional flights of fancy, we refuse to come to grips with it, and because we do, it of course is worsened. There are many reasons for this, I suppose, historic reasons, psychological reasons, and yet it seems to me that nowhere in this country are we able as a people to really approach this enormous problem rationally. Rather, we approach it emotionally with results that are too painful to enumerate here.
Has the United States had adequate leadership in this area?
There has been, in my judgment, a serious default of leadership in the South and in the nation at large. I would put it in these terms. Obviously, this accommodation, required not only by law, but by our own Christian ethic, by our own concept of government, is a very difficult one for individuals to undertake. No one has seriously asked us to do this difficult thing. No one has seriously said to the American people, you've got to do it, whether it's unpleasant or not. I don't think that we've had the kind of leadership that makes possible a transition of this nature.
Mr. Ashmore, the South has been undergoing an almost traumatic experience in this area. Do you see any hopeful outcome? Is there any hopeful result likely to emerge from the South's experience in this area?
Well, in the short range and immediate view, no, I can't say that. I think, though, there's a possibility, if we look beyond the next year or two, that the patterns that ultimately will have to emerge in the South conceivably could become the patterns in which the nation will finally find a sort of resolution, temporary one, or at least a gradual and progressive resolution of this problem, which is now a national problem. I say, as I've said earlier, the Southern leadership has not been disposed to chart any positive course, but when it does, out of its own experience, which is unique to Americans, it could very well be that the patterns we evolve will be those that will be adopted not only here, but perhaps in other countries where there is a grave and serious color problem. That, I say, is highly speculative. Yet I would remind you that the South, once before, made an accommodation for her Negro minority under what I think were far more adverse circumstances than those that confront us today. That was the time when the slave was freed, and the South had to make some provision, and itself having lost a war and being economically depleted, had to make some provision for a mass of freedmen who were universally illiterate and who had only primitive agricultural skills. Well, through the period of Reconstruction and after, we did work out an accommodation which at least met the minimum requirements for survival, which contained many injustices and yet also provided some protection for these people at a time when they were at the mercy of whites. We created second-class citizenship, and I think that era has run out, and it now must be replaced. Yet I think the difficulty of that first accommodation was perhaps more serious than the one that we are now, I think, by history required to make.
Harry Ashmore speaks for many in this country, but there are many others, especially in the South, who see this problem very differently. And so we took to the road again, heading further south into Mississippi. As we drove through Arkansas and Louisiana that night, I thought about the man we were going to see. Mr. William Simmons had been recommended to us as the most articulate voice of the conservative South. I knew that before the Supreme Court decision, he had been an accountant in Louisiana. Not a politician or a political leader by profession, he had given up that job to accept the editorship of the Citizens Council, official newspaper of the movement in 15 southern states to preserve segregation. We drove most of the night, and the next morning were a few miles outside Jackson, Mississippi, on the country road that led to the Simmons place. I remember I was somewhat nervous as I thought of the questions I planned to ask. Mr. Simmons, in the midst of the many, many points of view on this question, there seems to be one point on which everybody is agreed, namely that the United States has a race problem on its hands. Would you agree with this?
Yes, I think you could say that.
Well, what do you think is at the root of this problem?
I think at the root of the problem, Dr. Smith, of course, is the age-old relationship that has existed between two different races. History tells us that there has always been a problem where two races occupied the same area. As concerns our present situation in particular, I think it's quite clear that the activities of the interracial pressure groups have handed us our problem in its present form.
If we leave to one side this question of the immediate for a moment and look at the problem in long-range perspective, you say that there has always been a problem. Do you think this problem will ever be solved? And if so, what would constitute a solution to it?
Well, with large problems of this nature, of course, it's very difficult to say that there would be any solution in the sense of a neat, buttoned-up sort of thing that you could file away and say at this point in history it's been solved. I think that the only real solution is the elimination of the problem, of course, and that means complete physical separation of the two different ethnic groups.
How would this be affected?
There's some growing body of opinion among Negroes themselves on the idea of Negro repatriation. This is a rather historical movement that has roots going back to the early parts of the 19th century. That is for the establishment of a Negro home in Africa, where they would have complete self-determination for themselves.
And you say that this is a growing sentiment on their part, as you say?
There have been various degrees of interest at times in our history. It does seem to be on the upsurge now. In the absence of this, as, say, a present practical matter, why, of course, the existence of a biracial civilization such as we have in the South, while not the answer, so to speak, at least it's workable.
Is America on the move with respect to this question? In what direction do you think we're actually going? Do you foresee any changes in the racial pattern in the immediate future?
Yes, Dr. Smith, I think it's certainly on the move. I think there may be a difference of opinion as to which direction it may be moving. I think the movement has been in the direction of integration from, say, the early part of this century up until and perhaps sometime beyond the Supreme Court decision on the school cases. Since that time, I think there's something of a counter trend setting in. I think there's a very distinguishable degree of solidarity growing among the Southern people particularly, and very discernible among the Northern people in the opposite direction.
Do you expect that our society will then in the future be more segregated than it is at present?
I shouldn't be at all surprised. As a matter of fact, I think one outgrowth of the increased pressure for integration, that is complete social integration, in the northern part of the United States will result in the phenomenon, say, of a white bloc that will tend to offset in political and local influence the colored bloc.
Mr. Simmons, do you believe that all men are created equal?
No, sir, I certainly do not. I think it's very apparent that they are not created equal. There are no two people alike.
Obviously, individuals are not equal, but does this inequality carry over into groups so that some groups are actually superior or inferior to others?
I would say certainly that groups are different, Dr. Smith. This does not necessarily imply general or complete inferiority, but certainly inferiority and superiority in certain characteristics. For example, in certain physical characteristics, I think it's quite plain that the Negroes as a group are superior. I think their production of boxing champions, for example, is a case in point. Probably their ability at racing, sprinting especially, as distinct from long-distance running, seems to certainly bear this out. In other areas, I think the evidence points to certain lacks on the Negro's part as a race.
What would these be specifically?
Well, it's fairly common knowledge, of course, that throughout history and throughout the United States in our present stage, wherever the colored people are found as a group, they're at the bottom. Now, of course, there are explanations made of this, usually of a social and economic nature, that he's excused on the grounds that he has been deprived of certain advantages. Of course, you realize that in a free or relatively free society, or at least let's say a competitive society, this is a matter of individual accomplishment, I believe.
Mr. Simmons, do Negroes in Mississippi today have an equal chance at the good things of life?
Dr. Smith, an equal chance at the good things of life, of course, is something that varies with every man, regardless of which group he comes from. Speaking in generalities, though, which I assume you mean, of course, the Negroes in Mississippi have equality before the law. They have equality in an economic sense, in that they are as free to pursue their economic goals and betterment within the limitations of depressions and so on, just as everyone else.
I've heard you say, Mr. Simmons, that there is a Southern nationalism. Would you elaborate on this?
By that I mean something, an almost mystic attachment to the South that Southerners feel that apparently is peculiar to them. This is something that has been commented on not just by myself or other Southerners, but it's been noted by writers of national prominence. I mean something of the feeling of the Scotch for Scotland, as distinct for their feeling for the British Empire, of the Irish for Ireland. There's something of that feeling.
Willingness to die, if necessary, for the land and for the way of life which it represents.
Yes.
Do you feel that there are any adverse international effects to our racial situation here in America?
I'm inclined to think not. Of course, I have heard it said many, many times that we must integrate to please caste-ridden India or red China, which, of course, are not havens of racial equality by any manner of means. I think this is an argument that has been created by the integrationists. For example, the very newspapers and spokesmen for the integrationist side go abroad with these tales, exaggerated tales of what's going on in the South, and they say, this is bad, isn't it? And then they'll get a, yes, it's bad answer, then they'll come back at us and say, well, you see, you haven't satisfied these people.
If we can come back for a moment to the moral question, there are some who feel that your position is incompatible with belief in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Do you think this is so?
Well, let's say that the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man is a spiritual concept, as I understand it. It has been very significant to me that this argument is of very, very recent origin. As far as I know, the Bible hasn't changed. All of the generations of good Christian people who founded this country never seemed to be particularly belabored by this point. Yet here it's arisen just recently. And of course, a skeptical person might be inclined to think that it is an argument rather than a dogma.
Mr. Simmons, is it fair to characterize your position as advocating white supremacy?
Dr. Smith, may I be equally frank with you?
Please do.
I don't like that term.
Uh-huh.
I think it's a loaded term. I think it has connotations that are very unpleasant.
Well, take it apart.
Well, now,
what you
if
think.
by white supremacy you mean a situation of oppression or exploitation, no, I would not be. And many of us, I would say the vast majority of people in our part of the country do not hold that view. However, if we turn it around and look at it the other way, we certainly would not be in favor of black supremacy. And that, Dr. Smith, is what we feel is at issue in the present circumstances.
I had talked to two men and found opposite answers to the same question. But far apart as their answers were, I knew that there was another entire side to this question that hadn't even been touched, the Negro side. The Negro South had yet to be sounded. Next week, I'd like to tell you what I found there.
This is National Educational Television.